Way back when we began our study of the book of Proverbs, I said that one of the most practical ways to study the book is to trace a subject or a topic, a term that is used, and mark it, highlight it, however you do it in your app or your Bible, and then put those verses together and you can study those themes or those topics. We have done that with wisdom and understanding, the fear of the Lord. We spent a week or two on the fool, and today we come to the sluggard. Great word, isn't it? Sluggard. Translated sometimes slothful. Once or twice in the NIV it's translated lazy. But this morning, this is what we're going to look at. The person that Solomon calls the sluggard or the slothful. There is a device in English, I think it's called onomatopoeia. And if it's not called that, that's still a fun word to say, onomatopoeia. But I think that's the device that means a word that sounds like what it is. And that's what sluggard and sloth, you can tell what it is just by how the word sounds. It is impossible to say those words in a chipper way. Sluggard, it's still sluggard, Slothful, it's still sloth. It is what it sounds like. It is a person that is habitually lazy. It is a person that does not take personal responsibility for their own lives. They have the ability to work, but they refuse to do it. They don't have the drive or the common sense to provide for their own needs. They just do everything they can to get away from work. The term is used at least 14 times, depending on your translation, in the book of Proverbs. And we come to it because we're in chapter 6. And in verse 6, he says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest. How long will you lie there, you sluggard? How long will you get up from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man." Now, how do you know if someone's a sluggard? How do you know if you're a sluggard? Well, the best way is to look at these verses in the book of Proverbs, and I've tried to kind of organize them in 3 or 4 main categories so that we can look at them together. First, the characteristics of the sluggard. This is how you define it, by the characteristics. And I put the verses in your notes so that you wouldn't have to be flipping all over the book of Proverbs as we study what Proverbs says about a sluggard. And some of you probably have heard one of Jeff Foxworthy's bits, you might be a redneck if, well, Solomon says you might be a sluggard if, and he gives us these characteristics. First, the sluggard procrastinates. His life's motto is never do today what you can put off till tomorrow. And when he gets tomorrow, it's the same thing. Never do today what you can put off till tomorrow. They have developed the ability to put off starting to do something. And if they ever get around to doing something, they have developed the ability to not finish what they started. They intend to do it, but like verse 10, but first they need a little more sleep, they need a little more slumber, they need a little more rest. And in essence, what the sluggard is doing is saying, I'm going to get around to doing this. Oh, I should have brought it. You ever seen that round to it? People say, whenever I get around to it, and there's a circle that says to it on it, and said, here's your round to it. The sluggard is going to get around to it, but he needs a little bit of rest first. And this is something that, as you study this, it seems to be that the sluggard truly believes, he has somehow convinced himself or herself, that if I just get a little bit more rest, then I'll be able to do this. But first I need my rest. And they have convinced themselves, if you were to ask them, are you ever going to get around to doing this? They'll say, yes, I'm going to do it, but I need some rest first. Or I need to do this first. And so they just keep procrastinating. And you can see this in several different verses. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 27. Now, it's translated several different ways. The New American Standard says, a slothful man does not roast his prey, but the precious possession of a man is diligence. The NIV says, the lazy do not roast any game, but the diligent feed on the riches of the hunt. And the New King James says, the lazy man does not roast what he took in hunting, but diligence is man's precious possession. As I studied this and looked at the different ways it was translated, most interpret this to mean this. Even sluggards at times enjoy the thrill of the hunt. They like the excitement of the chase. And you may get them one day to actually go hunting. And they may actually catch something. But when they get back home and the thrill of the hunt is over and the excitement of the chase is over, rather than making the effort to clean the game and prepare it and eat it, they just sit down. They're done. They went out and killed something. Somebody else can take care of the rest of it. You may know people like that. They love the thrill of the hunt. They love the excitement of the chase, but they never get around to the daily stuff of life. They're around for the excitement, but they're not around for the drudgery of day by day doing what needs to be done. And that's why Solomon contrasts that to what the New King James says, the precious possession of the character trait of diligence. Diligence is sticking with it until it's complete. And diligence really is the opposite of being a sluggard. A diligent person is a man or woman who sees it through till it's complete. Don't stop halfway. Get the job done. And it's kind of interesting that the translations call it man's precious possession is his diligence. It's rare to see somebody that can stick to it and get the job done. A second illustration of this procrastination is kind of funny. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 24. A sluggard buries his hand in the dish, he won't even bring it back to his mouth. Solomon must have thought it was funny too, because he repeated it in chapter 26, verse 15. A sluggard buries his hand in the dish, he is too lazy to bring it back to his mouth. You probably know that in those days, people ate with their hands. This is a picture of a person who puts his hand, gets the bread and puts it into the dish to eat, and just goes, and never brings it back. Falls asleep while his hand's in the food, too lazy to bring his hand back. That's lazy, folks. And Solomon said that's what a sluggard is. He's so lazy that even if he gets his hand in there to eat, he's too lazy to bring it back to him again. Proverbs chapter 20, verse 4. Sluggards do not plow in season. So at harvest time, they look, but find nothing. That's interesting. He doesn't say sluggards don't plow in season, so at harvest time they have nothing. He says at harvest time they look, but find nothing. The sluggard never seems to fully understand the law of sowing and reaping. The law that if you're going to have a harvest, you got to plant something. And you got to plow up the ground, and you got to prepare the ground, and you got to get rid of the thorns and the weeds, and you got to do all those things that you need to do so that you can plant the seed so that you can have a harvest. The sluggard never gets around to the hard work of the sowing, but still, when it's harvest time, and his neighbors are going out and harvesting, he goes out to his field expecting that by magic, he's going to have a crop. One of the marks of maturity is doing what needs to be done when it needs to be done. The sluggard at sowing time, at preparing the field time, says, I need a little more rest, I need a little more sleep, I'll get around to it eventually. And then harvest time comes and there's nothing there because he did not do what needed to be done when it needed to be done. There are people in life who think that all of life should wait for their convenience and their mood. Life doesn't work that way. There's a certain time to harvest, but there's also a certain time to plant. And if you don't plant when it's time to plant, you're not going to harvest when it's time to harvest. I don't have any experience with this, but I've listened to enough people that have gardens that said, I put them in too early or I put them in too late. Jay's learning about the hard work of preparing for the harvest, and it's this bees, I'm tired today, and then come harvest time and there's no harvest. The sluggard still goes out, looks for the harvest, and can't figure out why he doesn't have it. Don't be a sluggard. Life isn't going to wait on you to feel like doing what you're supposed to be doing. Do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. So the first characteristic, you might be a sluggard if you procrastinate. Second, the sluggard makes excuses. Now here's something about a sluggard. They work so hard to make excuses that if they would spend half that much energy doing something, they could be productive. Don't kid yourself. Their mind is working faster than their body. When it comes to excuses as to why they couldn't, didn't, shouldn't, wouldn't, they can tell you. And the classic example, again humorous, and Solomon repeats it. Proverbs 22 verse 13. The sluggard said, "There's a lion outside. I'll be killed in the public square." Verse 13 of chapter 26, the sluggard says, "There's a lion in the road, a fierce lion roaming the streets." You going to come into work today? I couldn't possibly come into work today. There might be a lion out there, and he's going to eat me up. Now, how in the world do you come up with something like that? But a sluggard is an expert at coming out with excuses that in his mind are legitimate for why he shouldn't do what he didn't want to do to start with. And that's just, there might be a lion. And I'm sure if you're in management, you've heard some interesting examples of why people can't come into work that are pretty much are today's example of there might be a lion in the street. I can't come to work today because the light was red. Well, it'll change. But, the sluggard is excellent at making excuses. At his heart, or her heart, the sluggard is lazy. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 26. As vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so are sluggards to those who send them. Now, there are a couple of different ways that people interpret this verse. One is the frustration that you feel when you send a sluggard to do something for you. It's like you've got a message to send to somebody, and you send a sluggard to do it. And you never find out whether the person got the message or not, because the sluggard never gets back around. Even if they do deliver the message, they never get around to telling you they did. And some people say Solomon's almost saying, well, shame on you if you ask a sluggard to do that for you. If you're going to ask somebody that has a bad reputation of not ever getting around to accomplishing something, don't give them something important and essential to do, or you're going to be frustrated because it's going to be like smoke getting in your eyes, because they're just not going to do it. Other translations translate it, don't hire a sluggard because they will irritate you. It'll be like smoke to your eyes. If you depend on a sluggard, you're going to be disappointed and frustrated. They're never going to get around to doing what you ask them to do. You've probably been in meetings where they ask the same person for the 5th week in a row, well, what about this? Well, I'm waiting on, whatever. And they just never get around to getting the job done. Solomon says it's like smoke to your eyes because the sluggard is lazy. And he expands on that with a verse we'll come back to in a couple minutes as well. Proverbs 21, verse 25. The craving of a sluggard will be the death of him, because his hands refuse to work. Hebrew scholars say that basically what he's saying is the craving of a sluggard, or the desire of a sluggard, is for rest and pleasure. That's all he cares about. Rest and pleasure. Very self-centered, just, living life for himself. And that desire for rest and pleasure will ultimately be the end of that person, because idleness will bring you to ruin. And there's not going to be any harvest, and eventually your laziness is going to catch up with you, and you're going to pay the price. And so in another place, Solomon says, the sluggard has no sense. He isn't as smart as he thinks he is. Sluggards think they're pretty smart. They think they've got it figured out. And the sad thing is, and I'm jumping ahead of myself, but just the sad thing is, it usually takes pain for a sluggard to change their ways. So the sluggard has no sense. He's not as smart as he thinks he is. Proverbs 24. I went past the field of a sluggard, past the vineyard of someone who has no sense. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds. The stone wall was in ruins. This is because he doesn't know how to plow in season. He hasn't taken the time to prepare the ground, but he thinks he's smart. Proverbs 26:16, a sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 people who answer discreetly. He thinks, I've got this figured out. However it works, I don't really have to prepare my ground. I can let the thorns take over. I can let the weeds take over. It's okay. I'm still going to find a harvest, and I know better than these people do. I know you don't have to work that hard. I know you really can cut corners. And in his own conceit that he is this wise person, he comes to ruin, and his craving will ultimately be the death of him. The last characteristic that leads into the consequences is that a sluggard requires constant supervision and prodding. And if you have a sluggard that works for you, you know that's true. Proverbs 12:24, diligent hands will rule, but laziness, it's the word slothfulness, ends in forced labor. Proverbs 13:25, the righteous eats to their heart's content, but the stomach of the wicked goes hungry. Proverbs 16:26, the appetite of laborers works for them, but hunger, because their hunger drives them on. So apart from the pressure of constant supervision and constant prodding, the sluggard just isn't going to do anything, which leads to the consequences. If you're a sluggard, if you know someone who's a sluggard, you need to understand that it will take pain in some form or another to get the sluggard to change their ways. And that pain can come in problems. Proverbs chapter 6, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man. Some Hebrew scholars say that when the Old Testament talks about poverty, it's talking about more than just financial poverty. It's talking about hardships. It's talking about problems that you face in your life. And because the sluggard is a sluggard, the problems come on. Proverbs 15:19, the way of the sluggard is blocked with thorns, but the path of the upright is a highway. So there's problems, and then there's pressure. The verse again, Proverbs 12:24, diligent hands will rule, but laziness ends in forced labor. Now I know I gave you 3 words that begin with P and only 2 blanks. Pain is kind of the overarching concept there that comes into problems and pressure. Here's the principle. The only way a sluggard will break out of their slothfulness is when they suffer the consequences of their own slothfulness. As long as there are people covering for them, or doing for them, or providing for them, without requiring them to do anything for themselves, they will never get around to doing anything for themselves. And so, in Solomon's day, when there were no so-called safety nets, in Solomon's day, if you didn't work, you didn't eat. In Solomon's day, if you were lazy and just said, well, I'll get around to it tomorrow, there might be a lion in the street today, well, eventually, it was going to be your ruination because you weren't going to have any food, you weren't going to have anything but problems and pressure. And so Solomon says, if you're a sluggard, please change your ways before the pressures and the problems have to get to you. And I think the lesson is for us, and I just throw this out for you, I wonder sometimes, why in the world am I preaching as well? Because it's in Proverbs and we're studying Proverbs. And maybe you have a child or a grandchild that needs this, or one day will need this, or it's a good lesson to teach about how not to live your life. Is we sometimes we love somebody and we love them to their own detriment, because we don't understand that love has boundaries, and we don't understand that sometimes love says no. And so as a result of that, if you try to always protect somebody who is a sluggard and do for them what they should be doing for themselves and what they can be doing for themselves, then you stop them from ever getting out of it, because they're being taken care of, and you're protecting them from the pressure and the problems that God wants to send their way to wake them up and to help them grow to be the person He created them to be. And so when you try to think from Solomon's writings here, what the source of their problem is, I flipped it to also how not to be a sluggard. And there's really two main things that are at the heart of why the sluggard is the way they are. The sluggard is self-seeking. They don't want to do anything for others. They don't want to do anything that inconveniences them. They don't want to do anything that causes them any sacrifice. They are very self-centered and self-seeking. So if you're not going to be a sluggard, live for others. That's the heart of the Christian faith. Live for others. And again, it goes back to verses 25 and 26 of Proverbs 21. The craving of a sluggard will be the death of him, because his hands refuse to work. But all day long he craves for more. And that's the way the sluggard is. They keep wanting more, but they refuse to work. But they keep wanting more, and they refuse to work. And so the way not to be a sluggard is to make sure you live for other people. Proverbs 13, verse 4. A sluggard's appetite is never filled, because they keep wanting more and more and more. But the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. There's that word diligent again, in contrast to being a sluggard. A sluggard wants the good things in life, just doesn't want to have to work for it, and doesn't understand the biblical concept of give, and it will be given to you. He wants people to give to him without ever first giving to others. God's priority is others. God's priority is that we live for other people. The righteous have a concern for other people. Live for others. If you live for others, you will not be a sluggard. The second main characteristic of a sluggard is that he is very short-sighted. That's why the first verse we read, Proverbs 6:6, go to the ant, you sluggard, and consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, it has no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in the summer and gathers its food at harvest. The sluggard is short-sighted. If you do not want to be a sluggard, prepare for the future. The sluggard only thinks about the present, never thinks about the future, never thinks about the consequences of the decisions he's making today. He fails to plan for the future. So he doesn't have a future because he hasn't prepared for it. If you're going to be what God has called you to be, a diligent person who sees things through to completion, you've got to prepare for the future. You've got to realize that there is a time to plant, and when you plant at the right time, then there will be the harvest. And sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I'm not exactly sure when, we're going to come back to these verses in chapter 6 and talk about the ant and the biblical lessons for living that we get from the ant. But one of them is what he says there. He stores his provisions in the summer and gathers his food at the harvest. The ants are superb at storing up things for when they're going into hibernation and making sure they have enough supplies to get them through the winter. It's an important lesson for us in life. Prepare for the future. Most importantly, prepare for eternity. Prepare for that future that's going to last forever. So I got to the end of my study and said, now what do you do to a group of people that you know from Open Door? I don't know a sluggard among you. So how do you apply this lesson? Well, first, if you find some characteristics of slothfulness in your life, please wake up before the pain and the pressure and the problems have to overwhelm you. Secondly, if you know somebody who is a sluggard, pray that God will cause them to open up their eyes early in the stages of their path being hedged around with thorns. We don't want people that we love to suffer, but the harsh reality is sometimes we've got to go through things to learn things. And we ought to pray, just Lord, protect them, from their own self. You ever pray for the Lord to protect you from your own stupid decisions? Sometimes we've got to do that. And I think there's some lessons here that you can develop, as you talk to your grandchildren and great-grandchildren as they grow up and get older, about the value of work and the value of diligence and seeing things through and taking care of your own responsibilities and doing what you're required to do and being diligent and seeing it through. And most of all, I think that's the prayer that we leave today with is, Lord, help us to be diligent. Help us to finish the job, because there are many times in life where we just get tired, and we know there's a job to be done, and we just are tired, and we just need to say, Lord, increase my strength, increase my determination, freshen my vision of what you've called me to do, so that I can do what you've put me here to do, and so that when we hear him and see him one day, he will say, well done, good and faithful servant. Lord, may we be diligent. The world knows too much of lazy people. The world knows too much of people who say they're going to do something and never get around to doing it. Lord, may those of us who call ourselves Christians be people who are people of their word, people who are examples of hard work because we're doing our work to you and not for even our boss. May we be diligent in completing the work you've given me to do. One of the most challenging things, Lord Jesus, that you said on this earth was when you told the Father, I finished the work you put me here to do. Not everybody was saved, not everybody was healed, not everybody believed, but you had finished your job. Lord, may we live our lives so that when we come to the end of it, we can pray that same prayer. Father, I finished the work you gave me to do. And now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine on you and give you his peace now and evermore. Amen. God bless you. Thanks you for coming out today. You're dismissed.